On a hot, sticky, overcast day in North Texas, a 24-year-old woman would go missing in broad daylight from the wide-open parking lot of a bar set beside a busy road. Kristen Charbonneau was employed as a dancer at the venue and was waiting on a cab for a ride home. Despite countless witnesses inside, Kristen seemingly vanished into thin air less than 5 minutes after walking outside. For her family, it was a clear-cut case of foul play. Kristen wasn't the type to just run off, and as hours became days, it was apparent something was very wrong. When she was reported missing, investigators apparently didn't feel the same sense of urgency that the family was plagued with, and so the ball began rolling slowly. However, months into the investigation, detectives would have only one person of interest: a customer at the bar, a man who walked out at the same time Kristen was leaving. The investigation into him, however, would hit countless dead ends, from his evasiveness to questioning to a disturbing admission later recanted, upon which the entirety of the case precariously dangles without an ability to move forward. This is Trace Evidence, episode 225, The Disappearance of Kristen Charbonneau. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the mysterious 2005 disappearance of 24-year-old Kristen Charbonneau. Before getting into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. As a final note, this year, CrimeCon will be taking place in Orlando, Florida from September 22nd through the 24th. I'll be there representing Trace Evidence on Podcast Row, and I hope to see you too. Visit crimecon.com and use promo code TRACE to save 10% on your pass. That's crimecon.com, promo code TRACE. Kristen Charbonneau was a bright, loving, and kind woman. The eldest of 5 siblings, she'd experienced both great triumphs and painful losses. However, things were starting to turn around, and she was eager and excited to marry her longtime boyfriend and move away with him. However, in the middle of a random day, she would mysteriously vanish in broad daylight. This is episode 225, The Disappearance of Kristen Charbonneau. The dusty yellow cab was traveling north beneath the wide span of graying clouds, with only a faint glimmer of the blue Texas sky peeking between the broken clumps and widening cracks. It was a humid day, and rising temperatures seemed to slicken everything down with a sticky dampness. Stepping out from their air-conditioned homes and vehicles, locals could feel the heat riding on light winds as it swept by in strips of thick, gluey air, offering little comfort to the sweat beating on their foreheads and running down their backs. It was an average summer afternoon for the citizens of North Texas, but for one family, it would be the beginning of a painfully tragic and frustrated campaign charged with not just the recovery of a missing daughter, but the arrest and conviction of the person responsible. Executing a quick left, the cab pulled into the sparse parking lot of a local gentleman's club, Baby Dolls, whose bright pink entryway awning certainly achieves its purpose of catching the eye and turning the heads of passing motorists. During later hours after the sun had set and locals were ready to head out for the evening, it was a popular club where it could be hard to find a space to park. However, when the cabbie arrived, it was early in the afternoon hours of a Thursday, hardly the time you'd expect to find much more going on than a few folks sitting at the bar and the daily travelers who earned themselves the title of regulars. The cabbie hadn't come to find entertainment for himself, however. He'd been dispatched by the office following a call from the establishment itself. One of the dancers needed a ride, and many of the cab drivers in the area had become familiar with her since she didn't own a car, so cab rides were her primary method of getting to and from work. Normally, the driver would arrive to find his fare just inside the main parking lot entrance, standing a few feet from the bright pink canopy. Sometimes, though, the traveler wasn't waiting, and so the cabbie would temporarily park in front of the building, head inside, and find their passenger. Sometimes they'd linger for a while, taking a seat at a table as they waited. Other times, they simply informed the employees that they were out front and waiting. On this particular day, as the cabbie turned his vehicle around after entering the lot and slowly perused the area, he didn't see anyone waiting. Frustrated by a combination of factors, the oppressive heat, the missing passenger, the growing threat of a storm, he decided not to go inside. Instead, he picked up his phone and called in. A woman answered, and as the cabbie explained that he was outside waiting, the woman noted that his passenger, a dancer employed there at the club, had walked outside just a few minutes earlier and should be standing right there. Hanging up, the cabbie waited around for a few minutes and, failing to find anyone, he scratched out the stop, listing it as a no fare, and drove back out onto the nearby roadway. 2 days later, when the missing woman's boyfriend arrived home and found she wasn't there, he contacted authorities. 24-year-old Kristen Charbonneau, who had worked as a dancer at the club for years, hadn't been seen since she'd walked out the door that Thursday afternoon. Her disappearance would soon become a case wrought with deception, confusion, heartbreak, and desperation. How does a woman go missing from a parking lot in broad daylight, in a window of time encompassing less than 10 minutes, and no one sees or hears a thing? Well, as I imagine you'd expect, there's at least one person both investigators and Kristen's family believes know exactly what happened that hot and humid afternoon in North Texas. Kristen Elizabeth Charbonneau was born on Saturday, September 27, 1980, in Shreveport, Louisiana, to parents David and Monica. Kristen was the Charbonneaus' firstborn child, and they were extremely excited to begin their adventure as parents. Kristen, described by friends and family as a sweet, kind, and caring young woman, became the center of their universe, their little daughter who they loved more than anything. The family would soon begin expanding, a little more than 2 years later, in August of 1982 when Kristen's first brother, Dustin, was born. 16 months later, in December of 1983, Monica gave birth to another son, Joey. According to the family, Kristen was thrilled with the arrival of her little brothers and saw herself in a way as their caretaker and protector. She looked after them, supported them, and played with them whenever she could. Kristen loved the time she had with her brothers, and whether they were playing house or climbing around outside on some fantastical battlefield, they were always smiling and laughing. A quote from the family's website described their relationship, saying, quote, "Kristen looked after them as if they were her own children. She was somewhat of a tomboy, but loved dressing up just the same." End quote. Sadly, tragedy would come for the Charbonneau siblings for the first time in August of 1987, 1 month before Kristen's 7th birthday. That month, Dustin, the Charbonneau's first son, would be diagnosed with terminal liver cancer. Kristen, too young to understand at the time, was devastated when Dustin passed away on Tuesday, September 22nd. He was just 5 years old. Obviously, this was an extremely difficult time for the family as they all suffered through this unimaginable loss. However, the bitterness and tragedy of Dustin's passing would be counterbalanced by a joyful experience just 1 month later. Monica had been 8 months pregnant when Dustin passed away. On Thursday, October 29th, the Charbonneaus welcomed home their second daughter, who they'd name Alicia. While nothing could ever replace Dustin or fully alleviate the pain of a lost sibling and child, Alicia's arrival helped shine some much-needed light into the family. They were able to lose themselves in the celebration of life, while also acknowledging the grief of loss. But the new joy brought in by another child helped keep them from veering too closely to the abyss of despair. According to the family, Kristen took extremely quickly to her baby sister, and over the years the two would forge what has been described as a special bond that no one else could get close to. She looked upon Alicia much as she had her brothers, as though it was her child. However, with this being her first and only sister, Kristen seemed to take it more seriously. Perhaps the loss of Dustin had instilled in her some sense in regard to the fragility of life in the absence of any guarantees. The family would write that Kristen took care of Alicia and taught her all of the important things she would need to know. Ultimately, the Charbonneau family made a shift, leaving Louisiana and heading west into Texas. They would settle in the city of Irving, located in Dallas County and part of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. The 1980s saw a large population explosion in the area, as over the course of the next 2 decades, the population would nearly double, from just over 100,000 residents to just shy of 200,000. Entering school, Kristen performed well, although her interests seemed to keep her attention outside of the classroom. According to the family, her brother Joey would become, in a sense, the protector of his sisters. Whenever they had a problem, Joey stepped in to handle it. From bullies to angry ex-boyfriends, there was no challenge Joey wouldn't overcome to look out for his siblings. Then there came somewhat of a surprise. On Friday, August 16th, 1996, 1 month before Kristen was set to celebrate her 16th birthday, Monica and David welcomed their final child, a son they would name Brandon. The family would later state that Brandon had the benefit of being raised by every member of the family, as his nearest sibling in age was Alicia, who by this time was approaching her 9th birthday. David and Monica would go on to say that Brandon loved spending time with his brother and sisters, and they relished their moments together. With Kristen turning 16, she was able to take Brandon to all of the fun places in the areas, even if his parents were busy working or other siblings had responsibilities to keep up with. Brandon seems to have become the apple of the entire family's eye. According to them, they attended his school and sporting events, cheered his name loudly, and went to show him that he was loved and supported no matter what he was doing. Kristen would actually often visit her brother at school. Multiple times per week, should her schedule allow, she'd make the short walk from the family home to the school where she'd sit down and have lunch with her little brother. They were sweet, quick pop-ins that Kristen really loved, to be able to go out of her way to make his day a little better, a little brighter, and a lot more loving. We don't have much information to explain if there were issues or other reasons for it, but around this time, Kristen appears to have begun struggling in school. Well, perhaps that isn't the right term precisely, but to say her interest in school had dramatically waned would be an understatement. Despite the fact that she and her family are listed as living in Irving at the time, Kristen would attend Ryan High School in Denton, 40 miles to the northwest of Irving. This would be her final stretch for high school, and not too long after, she would drop out entirely. Despite this, Kristen didn't simply move on in life, leaving school behind forever, and instead entered a program and obtained her GED. In 1999, when Kristen was 19 years old, she was out looking for a job. When she finally did pick up work, she did her best to keep it secret from her parents, as she knew they would never approve. She ended up getting hired on as a dancer at Baby Dolls, a topless bar located along South Industrial Boulevard, or FM 157, on the border between Fort Worth and Euless, a small city in Tarrant County which had grown rapidly in more recent years. As is often the case for women employed in that particular industry, Kristen took on a stage name and would be known around the club as Devon. While Kristen saw this as an easy way to make some quick money, when her family found out, they were less than thrilled. Monica would later explain, quote, "I didn't talk to Kristen about her work, as she knew how I felt about it and encouraged and often pleaded with her to stop working there." End quote. Working at the club, Kristen would meet and eventually begin a relationship with a customer named Mike Marcooler. At the time, Marcooler was an Air Force Reserve major as well as a pilot for American Airlines, and was more than twice Kristen's age, being 41. Marcooler was described as a regular at the club who had become enamored with Kristen, but she didn't exactly reciprocate. According to the family, Marcooler threw around a lot of money and was very generous when it came to Kristen, which of course she relished. Who wouldn't? Initially, that was all it was to the 19-year-old, an older man who showered her in riches for her company. That, however, would begin changing, as Kristen would soon find herself developing strong feelings for the man who was once her benefactor. Her sister, Alicia, explained to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, saying, quote, "He was much older. They were total opposites. But he would give her all kinds of money, so she stayed around. At first, it was all about staying with him because of the money. End quote. As the relationship between Kristen and Mike developed, the two became closer, and eventually she left the family home and moved into Mike's house, located approximately 7 miles north of Baby Dolls in the city of Euless. This dramatic shift may have been part of the impetus for a series of issues which would arise between the two. However, there was something else at play. Kristen had struggled with some mental health issues off and on throughout her life, but things had become more serious the older she'd gotten. Ultimately, she'd receive a diagnosis of being bipolar and was properly medicated, but that didn't always mean things went according to plan. The influence of any other mind-altering substance, such as alcohol, could compromise the effect of her medication and/or temporarily accelerate her mental health issues. Unfortunately, alcohol wasn't the only substance at play. Somewhere along the line, no one has ever gone into great detail about the actual origins, though many have pointed a finger towards where she worked. Kristen would develop a cocaine addiction. This, combined with the use of alcohol, turned her life upside down for a dark and difficult period of time. The struggle seems to be illustrated in several encounters with police over the course of the next few years. In 2001, Kristen was arrested and charged with driving while intoxicated, for which she served a 20-day sentence in a Tarrant County jail. A year later, after being stopped in the Texas city of Grand Prairie, she was arrested for possession. However, a grand jury declined to indict and the charge was dropped. In July of 2003, Mark Cooler filed a report with police after Kristen took his car. She returned with it a short time later. 2 months after that, in September, Euless police officers responded to a call about a woman who appeared to be inebriated stumbling down the street. When they arrived a short time later, they identified the woman as Kristen Charbonneau. June of 2004 would see 2 separate incidents. Firstly, Kristen was arrested in Bedford on suspicion of DWI. Later in the month, Mark Cooler would contact authorities to request that they dispatch officers to his home. Reportedly, he'd arrived home and found another man in the house with Kristen, who he asked the police to remove from the premises. Finally, 6 months later in December, Kristen was accused of assaulting a man in a convenience store who she allegedly thought was checking her out too closely. After leaving, someone had written down her license plate and it was tracked back to the home she shared with Mark Cooler. Investigators later noted that no one was ever arrested for any of the calls to the Euless home, and they had never taken a report for issues of domestic violence. In June of 2005, Kristen was sentenced to spend 40 days in jail stemming from the 2004 DWI arrest in Bedford. According to her family, issues between her and Mark Cooler were coming to a head and the two were constantly arguing. Alicia would later say that Mike was extremely jealous when it came to Kristen and that this could cloud his vision, sometimes making her afraid. Alicia explained, quote, "She told us that if anything ever happened to her, we need to look at Mike." End quote. Now, while this relationship sounds like it's quite toxic, there appears to have been another side to it, one which was happier and healthier, so long as drugs and alcohol were out of the picture. In early August of 2005, approximately 1 week before Kristen's disappearance, her mother received a surprising call. While Mark Cooler owned a large, beautiful home in Euless, he didn't spend a lot of time there. His work called for him to be in Wichita Falls, approximately 130 miles northwest. Since the commute was so long, Mark Cooler frequently spent the bulk of his week, Monday through Friday, in Wichita Falls, and then he'd come back home for weekends. Well, on that day in August, Monica received a call from an extremely excited and happy Kristen who had big news to share. She was getting married. Monica explained, quote, "I was so happy for her. Girls that start dancing so young can get stuck in that life, but Kristen was planning on getting married and moving away from it all." End quote. According to the family, Kristen was extremely excited. She'd be getting engaged, and together the couple would move to Wichita Falls, something her family hoped would assist her in getting away from her work at the Topless Bar. For his part, Mike acknowledged the couple had been through a lot, but when you cleared away the cause of many of those problems, things were quite good. They wanted to be together, and at least for him, he was deeply in love. Mike later noted the issues but shrugged them away, saying, quote, "She had problems, but I planned to marry her," end quote. Unfortunately, Kristen would never get the opportunity to walk down the aisle, as less than a week later, she would mysteriously vanish. With Kristen's fiancé, Mike, working away from the home for the bulk of the week, she often found herself wanting company. It was a big house and she hated being alone in it. Starting on Wednesday, August 10th, she wouldn't have to be alone as her sister, Alicia, was planning to stay at the house with her. The two sisters had a great time together, and when Kristen got home from work, they'd often get together in the kitchen, cook their meals, and get relaxed on the couch for a fun movie. Monica would later say that these were some of her daughter's favorite activities, telling CNN, quote, "She liked to stay home, watch TV, watch a movie, and she wanted to spend time with her family," end quote. Brandon, Kristen's younger brother, would be turning 9 on Tuesday, August 16th, and the family was excited for the event. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Kristen had been planning to go along with her mother to purchase a drum set for her little brother's birthday. They were set to go shopping together on Saturday the 13th, but Kristen would vanish before she could. On the evening of Wednesday, August 10th, Kristen and Alicia spent much of the day together once Kristen got home from work. She cooked beef tips and rice for dinner, one of her favorites, as well as mac and cheese, one of Alicia's favorites, and the two then sat down to check out the Adam Sandler, Drew Barrymore comedy, 50 First Dates. There were 2 couches in the room and each sister claimed one as their own. Not too long into the movie, Alicia looked over and noticed that Kristen was drifting off to sleep. She would later state that she walked over, tucked her sister in, and told her that she loved her. Then she went to sleep as well. The morning of Thursday, August 11th began as normally as could be. At the time, Kristen was working day shifts at Baby Dolls, where her hours were 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. According to Alicia, nothing seemed out of the ordinary that day, and Kristen left the house heading for work between 11 and 11:30. According to coworkers and her bosses, Kristen arrived at the club, went to the back and changed out of her street clothes and started working. From this point forward, almost everything we know about Kristen's movements are subject to hot debate, contradictions, and a lot of confusion. A few hours later, around 3:30 that afternoon, there was a clash between Kristen and one of her managers. Depending which source you lay your trust in, one of 2 things happened. Either Kristen and the manager started arguing because of an unknown issue or just issues between them in general, or it was because the manager felt Kristen wasn't in good condition and wanted her to go home. Reportedly, Kristen often drank while she was at work, something her family believes was the result of her feeling ashamed about her job. On this particular day, a manager claimed that Kristen had been drinking, which obviously didn't mix well with her medication, and she began stumbling and showing signs of what the club would deem instability. Reportedly, the manager approached her while she was sitting at a table with a customer and told her to get changed and go home. The two argued back and forth for a few moments before Kristen headed towards the back, joined by another dancer, to change. Cab company records show that a call was placed from the club at precisely 3:41 p.m. requesting a pickup. The cab service used an automated service, and a female employee who placed the call later told police she received the automated message back confirming the cab had been dispatched. Now, according to employees, Kristen made her way from the back towards the front carrying her bag. While another dancer was walking with her, a man approached them from behind, took a hold of Kristen's bag, and walked out the door beside her. At the time, the other dancer assumed he was Kristen's cab driver, as oftentimes they would wait inside. This would be the last time anyone at the club laid their eyes on Kristen Charbonneau. Several minutes later, the club received a call from the cab driver. He told the woman on the other end of the phone that he'd arrived on the lot a few moments earlier, but didn't see anyone waiting for a ride. At the time, he was informed that Kristen had walked out the door just a few minutes earlier and should be right there. While the cabbie looked over the parking lot and he sat and waited for approximately 5 minutes before marking the call as a no fare and drove away. According to his statements, at no point during his time in the parking lot did he see Kristen or anyone else who looked like they were waiting for a cab. A few minutes later, the woman who had answered the phone stepped outside to see what was going on. but there was no sign of Kristen or the cab, leading her to assume that she'd gotten picked up. Kristen didn't come home from work that Thursday afternoon, nor did she appear anywhere on Friday the 12th. When she didn't show up for the birthday shopping trip she had planned with her mother on the 13th, the mother called over to her house. Being the weekend, Mike had arrived home and noticed Kristen wasn't there, and he hadn't heard from her in days. After speaking with Monica and learning that no one had seen or heard from her since Thursday afternoon, Mike contacted the Euless Police Department and filed a missing persons report. According to the family, investigators didn't respond with much urgency. Reportedly, they not only waited several days to even begin an investigation, but when they did, it was rather cavalier. Alicia would later state, quote, "It's that people looked at her only as a stripper, and no one cares. But she was the sweetest person you would ever meet." End quote. Detectives would later state that they acted upon the report immediately, and that 2 detectives were assigned to the case in the beginning. How exactly it went down seems subject to debate, but it might be worth noting that the first actual news articles I could find about this case begin in early September, 3 weeks after Kristen was reported missing. To start, investigators went down to Baby Dolls to interview everyone who knew Kristen, specifically those who had been there the day she was last seen. Here is where we get some of that conflicting information that helps cloud the waters of this case. According to the family's official website, the police files state that the 2 managers present were Alex, who placed the call to the cab company, and Terry, who claims to have accompanied Kristen to the door. Curiously, Terry allegedly told police that when walking Kristen to the door, they had actually seen the cab parked outside. We now know this was an untrue statement, as when police interviewed the cab driver, he once again explained that he never picked anyone up that day, and both phone and company records confirmed that he didn't arrive until after Kristen had seemingly disappeared. Now, was that a malicious lie designed to cover something up? Was it the result of an inaccurate memory or something else entirely? We have no way of knowing. However, there was another name that came up during the early investigation, that of a man named Daniel Glenn Moore. According to witnesses at the club, Moore, a 40-year-old man who was known as a regular, was there that afternoon. Another dancer who preferred that her name not be used would later select Moore out of a phono lineup, identifying him as the man who grabbed Kristen's bag and walked out the door with her. Interestingly, this wasn't the only story about him from that day. One of the other dancers told police that when Moore arrived, she approached his table, as she's trained to, and asked him if there was anything she could get him. According to her, he replied that he was waiting on Devin, Kristen's stage name. Later, Kristen was reported to have been sitting at Moore's table, and in fact, this is where she was when the manager approached and told her to end her shift early. When Kristen went to the back to change, Moore remained at the table, but according to witnesses, as Kristen was leaving, he walked up, grabbed her bag, and walked outside with her. However, in his rush to do so, he'd forgotten to pay his bill. A female employee told investigators that he walked out on his tab, leaving behind a hotel room key and a business card on the table. At this point, the woman started calling his cell phone. He'd given her his number earlier and had asked her out. There was no answer. She called several more times over the next few hours, but again, there was no answer. Approximately 2 to 3 hours later, sometime between 5:40 and 6:40 p.m., Moore returned to the club. When the woman approached him about his bill, he apologized and handed over the cash, noting that he'd never intended not to pay up. The woman then asked Moore if he'd seen Kristen outside, to which he allegedly responded that he had given her a ride home. When the woman told him that she'd been trying to call him the whole time he was gone, Moore reportedly told her that he'd been out working on his boat and didn't have his phone with him. According to witnesses at the club, something seemed different about Moore when he came back. They described his demeanor as gruff, almost grumpy, and that after paying his bill, he took a seat at the bar and started drinking shot after shot. According to police records, several people stated that earlier he'd seemed approachable and interested, but by this time, he didn't seem to have any interest in anyone else in the club other than the bartender. The first time investigators spoke to Daniel Moore, it was rather casual, conducted over the phone rather than in person. According to detectives, Moore acknowledged being in the club that day but claimed he didn't know who Kristen was, which is interesting considering a witness claims he was specifically looking for her. In his recollection of events, he'd seen a manager arguing with a dancer, though he claimed she'd been seated at the table next to his, not with him specifically. As the argument began, Moore says he went to the bathroom and, upon returning, realized he didn't have his cell phone with him. Moore claimed he had laid the phone on the hood of his car and forgotten about it, meaning that it was probably lying in the road somewhere. This, he claims, is what caused him to leave the club that afternoon. In his statement, as he was leaving, a woman with long, dark, wavy hair stepped in front of him. This was Kristen. And he tells police that as the two walked out of the club, he made some offhanded comment to her like, having a bad day. Then he got into his own car and drove away. Now, curiously, Moore claims that he was only gone from the club for somewhere between 15 to 20 minutes and that when he returned, Kristen was still standing outside waiting for her cab. Moore added that upon returning, he saw a blue or silver car nearby and he thought that maybe the occupants were talking to Kristen. That's especially interesting because we have accounts from the cab driver as well as the woman answering the phone inside who both reported that within minutes of going outside, Kristen was gone, and when the cab driver arrived, she was nowhere to be seen. So how do you make any sense of that? Clearly someone's lying, or maybe more than one person is. Either way, based on the available evidence and information, Dan Moore's accounting of that afternoon simply doesn't fit. Not to mention, he told two different versions, one to the woman at the club, one to detectives. These will not be his final version of events. While investigators informed the family that they hadn't yet uncovered any evidence which would confirm that Kristen had been the victim of foul play, they were starting to lean that way. They had no crime scene, no witnesses, and in all reality, no crime to charge someone with. But her absence could not be explained, and with each passing day, their concern grew more sharp. Detective Chuck Skiles of the Euless Police Department would later explain that they hadn't found any trace of Kristen, but added that she wasn't very easy to track. He stated, quote, "It's unlike her to go this long without contacting her brother and sister, who she was extremely close to. We have no paper trail because she always paid with cash. She didn't have a bank account, a cell phone, or credit cards." End quote. There was only one thing which was certain. Kristen was missing. The how and the why would be much more difficult to determine, but the who was starting to come into focus. Given the inconsistencies between Moore's statements, the timeline, and eyewitness accounts, detectives began taking a deeper look at the businessman from nearby Arlington. Over the course of the next few months, police did everything they could to get Daniel Moore's attention. They very much wanted him to come down to the station for a full official interview, but he had suddenly become difficult to find. Police started leaving business cards at his front door and messages on his voicemail, but they never got any answers. A few weeks went by, and then they got a call from Moore, and when they asked him to come and speak with them, he said he was too busy. The next time police called Moore, they found the outgoing message on his phone had changed. Now, having been recorded by a woman, she stated that Moore would be unavailable for the next 3 weeks. Investigators continued calling and leaving messages until Moore's voicemail box was full. As detectives worked the case, both Kristen's family as well as her fiancé, Mike, didn't feel like they were taking the investigation seriously enough, and so they started working it from their own ends. Mike went on to hire a private investigator who he hoped might find answers for him and the family, but relations between the Charbonneaus and Mike quickly wore thin. Their daughter was missing, and while they believed the details of her disappearance made little sense, they also had in the back of their minds the morbid warning Kristen had passed along. Should something ever happen to her, look at Mike. So that's what they did. Many of the issues between Mike and the family seemed to be a result of stress from the disappearance and what could be written off as a miscommunication. According to the family, within days of Kristen's disappearance, they spoke with Mike and he told them to come over to the house and pick up her belongings. Certainly a cold and strange move. However, Mike remembered it differently. He explained to the Star-Telegram saying, quote, "They called asking what I was going to do with her stuff, and I just told them, I guess you could come get it. I never ordered them to my house to get the stuff." End quote. Mike added that this conversation did not take place within days, but rather weeks of Kristen's disappearance. Ultimately, Alicia was the one who went to the house to pick up Kristen's stuff. According to her, she grabbed her sister's clothes, her pet ferret named Squeaky, but left behind Buster, Kristen's Yorkshire Terrier. The family took good care of Squeaky and hoped they'd be able to present him to Kristen when she was found, but unfortunately, they never had that opportunity. For their part, investigators were able to confirm that Mike had been at work on the afternoon Kristen went missing, placing him hours away in Wichita Falls. They were also able to identify the whereabouts of the cab driver in the minutes and hours after he received the no fare call. Both men have since been ruled out as suspects. When it came to Daniel Moore, however, while police would not identify him directly as a suspect, they did refer to him as a person of interest. For their part, Kristen's family began with her address book. They started tracking down owners of the numbers, asking them if they'd seen Kristen or had any information about her disappearance. They moved on to flyers, producing thousands of them which showed Kristen's photo and gave a description of her last known movements. These flyers were placed all over town and even on the walls outside of Baby Dolls, but curiously, the family came to learn that people working at the club were in the habit of tearing the flyers down. Kristen's father, David, would explain, quote, "Baby Dolls didn't want the bad publicity, so they took down our flyers as soon as we put them up." End quote. Detectives began heading down a number of different avenues. Firstly, they sent officers out to various topless bars and strip clubs throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth area, interviewing customers, dancers, and managers in hopes that someone might have heard something or might have a story to tell about a disturbing encounter. No one seemed to have any information, though. If a dancer or employee was arrested at any time, police were quick to send a detective down to question them about Kristen while they were in lockup. Again, however, this yielded little helpful tips. One, which claimed that Kristen had gone off to Las Vegas, was all they had to cling to. So detectives sent information to the Las Vegas police, but never heard back. Harland Westmoreland, then assistant chief of the Euless Police Department, told reporters that they had thus far done everything in their power to try and find the answers, including asking both the Texas Department of Public Safety and the Texas Rangers to look over their investigation. They reached out to the FBI as well, but the Bureau chose not to get involved, noting that the case did not fall under their jurisdiction. The family maintained contact with investigators and did their best to stay informed of what was going on and what areas were being pursued. When they learned the details about Daniel Moore, their suspicions turned away from Mike and began closing in on Moore himself. The more they thought about it, the more it made sense. Someone offers her a ride or perhaps forces her, and from there, who knows what happens. Monica didn't believe her daughter would have been foolish enough to hop into a random car, telling reporters, quote, "She is cautious of most people, and since she had been working at the club for a while, she knew better than to leave with a customer. It is very likely someone followed her out the door and forced her into a car. We just want to know." End quote. 4 long months after Kristen went missing, Euless detectives were finally able to get in touch with Daniel Moore. While they had called him countless times only to be met with a message that the voicemail box was full, in early December they got through again. They were done playing phone tag with Moore, and the detective left an urgent message in which he explained that if Moore didn't come down to the station to answer questions, they were going to subpoena him to appear before the grand jury. This seemed to get through to Moore as on Monday, December 12th, he showed up at the Euless Police Department. He hadn't called anyone, nor had he made an appointment, perhaps hoping investigators working this case wouldn't be there. But they were. Moore was brought into a private room, at which time he was asked to give his account of what happened the day Kristen disappeared. This time, Moore said he realized his phone was missing and went to look for it, and when he returned to the club, Kristen was gone. When the detective pointed out that he'd told them a different story originally, the detective noted that Moore appeared to become uneasy. The detective pivoted, asking Moore if his wife was aware that he spent his free time in topless bars, to which Moore allegedly replied that his wife would be very upset as strip clubs were not in the contract, a seemingly bizarre way to refer to his own marriage. Sometime during the interview, Moore was asked whether or not he'd be willing to take a polygraph test. He apparently replied that there was no benefit to him in terms of taking that test. At that point, the detective told Moore that unless he was willing to take the test, they'd have no choice but to go and speak with his wife as they worked to further their investigation. Moore apparently replied that he would notify his wife that she'd be hearing from them. Not long after this exchange, Moore stated that he had a busy day ahead and needed to go. As you might imagine, detectives tried to get in touch with him for several weeks after this discussion, only to find themselves once again leaving voicemails and business cards. From this point forward, Moore no longer wished to communicate with them. Ultimately, the detective decided to swing by his house one afternoon, figuring all he'd end up doing is leaving another card, but it turned out differently. When he arrived at the house, he found Moore's wife was home, so he knocked on the door. When the detective asked whether or not she had been made aware of the business cards, Moore's wife replied that she noticed them, but that her husband had told her the situation was taken care of. At that time, the detective produced a photograph of Kristen and explained to Moore's wife that her husband had been the last person seen with her, and his story about that day had changed. The wife confirmed for investigators what vehicle Moore was driving the day of the disappearance, and also stated that as far as she could tell, he hadn't been acting any differently around the house. According to the family's website, the officer told Moore's wife about the polygraph offer and his visits to the Topless Club, which she apparently was not happy to hear. She told the detective she didn't approve of this behavior and that even though Moore had told the detectives he'd inform his wife, she was completely unaware of the whole situation. In the midst of this conversation, Moore arrived home, and according to the detective, when he saw him sitting there talking to his wife, all of the color drained from his face. When he demanded to know why the detective was there, he was reminded of the deal they'd made about the polygraph, to which Moore apparently responded by storming into a different room, slamming the door behind him. At that point, the wife asked the detective to leave so she could speak to her husband. He handed her a business card and asked her to call. Surprisingly, it was Moore who called later that night. He left a message for the detective telling him never to come to his house again and to leave his wife alone. This was his last direct contact with detectives. The Moores would later call this account of the day into question, claiming it hadn't gone down that way, but I've been unable to find any details about what they claimed did actually happen. The next few years would pass by simultaneously with the slow trudge of grief and the rapid expansion of desperation and anger. The family did everything within their power to keep the story in the headlines, something which would prove to be exceedingly difficult. Much like they had experienced with police in the early days, it seemed apparent that the media had little interest in telling the story of a missing stripper, as they would term it, while the family was trying to tell them this is a daughter, a sister, a kind and loving woman who deserved to be found. Regardless, the world kept spinning, and there was always a new sensational story to tell, which took up column space that could have belonged to Kristen. In October of 2006, 14 months after Kristen vanished, her family managed to get a big grab of public attention. 12 drivers in the NASCAR AutoZone Elite Division Southwest Series partnered together with the National Center for Missing Adults at the 4th Annual NASCAR Toyota All-Star Showdown. During the race, each driver would be behind the wheel of a car whose hood displayed the image of a missing person. Number 28, Thomas Martin, drove the car with Kristen's photo on it, and this led to a slew of articles and some major spotlight attention, at least for a time. It meant a lot to the Charbonneau family, who wrote a heartfelt thank you to Martin. Unfortunately, though, the case once again slid out of the headlines. That would all change a few years later, but sadly it would come in the aftermath of another family tragedy. Kristen's brother Joey had really struggled with his sister's disappearance. He was always the protector, the one his siblings could come to if they had a problem with anyone. Somehow, in a way that only those who have experienced it can understand, he blamed himself for not being there to take care of Kristen. Today, we would call it survivor's guilt, but at the time there were no easy answers, and even giving it a name only lends so much. It does little to solve the problem. Kristen's father, David, also struggled with this clash in his mind between his drive to protect his family, his moral values, and his desire to extract justice with his own hands. Father and son discussed the topic frequently, and according to the family website, what ultimately stopped either of them from taking action was that the family couldn't bear to lose another one of them, this time to a life sentence. In the years after Kristen's disappearance, Joey went down a dark path. He struggled to simply put one foot in front of the other, and his whole world seemed to be falling apart. It was an extremely stressful and difficult time, as one can only imagine. But by 2007, he seemed to have found his way through the darkness. He managed to turn his life around, getting a good job at which he earned Employee of the Month, and he started dating someone who later he planned to marry. He was making it work, finding his way through, and was coming out on the other side, better than he'd been in a long time. Sadly, though, his life would be cut short. On Saturday, May 17th, 2008, Joey was killed in a motorcycle accident. It was another devastating blow to a family who'd lost a son to cancer, a daughter to an unsolved case, and now another son to a crash. While the family struggled to find their way through the horrors they never imagined they would have to endure, they found a light in the darkness, one which both inspired and empowered them. Together, they would launch a campaign that would divide the community. While some supported their efforts entirely, others felt they were throwing around baseless accusations without consideration. To the family, though, it was living up to a promise that they would do anything to find justice for Kristen. The family put together a flyer, but this one wasn't just for posting around town. This flyer had a very specific audience, that of Daniel Moore and anyone who knew him, worked with him, or lived near him. They wrote a letter to Moore explaining who they were, how they'd learned about his association with their daughter, and what they were looking for, the truth about her disappearance. In the letter, they asked that Moore either agree to take the polygraph or sit down with investigators to get to the bottom of the matter. Were he innocent as he claimed, they assumed he'd be eager to clear his name, and if he were not involved, the family very much wanted to move on to someone else. But Moore never replied. A second letter was sent, and in this one, Moore was informed that if he didn't speak to police or take the polygraph, they'd begin sending these flyers to his family, friends, and neighbors. The family hoped that, just in order to get rid of their annoyance, Moore would speak to the police, or at a minimum, he might contact authorities to report what the family was doing, but neither of those things happened. However, a message sent by Kristen's father would result in a response, though not in the way they had imagined. At the time, MySpace was still the big social media network. Facebook was around, but it hadn't yet grown to the epic proportions we know it in today. Kristen had a MySpace page, and so her father decided to log in and take a look around. It wasn't an idle search, though. He began digging through his daughter's messages as he thought it was possible that Daniel Moore might have been one of the people in her DMs. He then began searching the entire site for a Daniel Moore who lived in the Arlington area, and he found him. There was a Dan with no profile picture living in Arlington. His profile said he was single, even though Daniel Moore was married. On the off chance that it was the same Dan, David typed out a message which began, "I am Kristen's father, and if you are the Dan Moore that killed my daughter, ... We don't know the full text of the message. Several days later, the same Euless detective working Kristen's case received a call from the Arlington Police Department. Daniel Moore had called in a complaint saying that he'd received a threatening message from David Charbonneau. The detective reached out to Moore, who actually answered, and when asked why he had a MySpace page listing himself as single, Moore reportedly told the detective that he used it to meet women, but, purely for friendship purposes, of course. In regard to the threat, Moore was informed that all he needed to do was to come down to the station and file an official report, and then detectives would inform the family to stop harassing him. Moore never came to the station, though. 2 more letters were sent from the Charbonneaus to the Moore residents, and in both they told Moore they were giving him time to consider their requests, although they assured him if he didn't do something, they were going to contact his wife next. To this letter, Moore did respond, though not in writing and not with phone call, but by changing his mailing address to a P.O. box. The family is uncertain whether or not he did so before his wife could receive or see one of the flyers. In an interesting story from the family's website, they originally targeted the wrong Daniel Moore, obtaining his address from public records. That Dan Moore, upon receipt of the letter, immediately went to his local police station saying he had nothing to do with Kristen's disappearance and he wanted his name cleared. When the family was notified, they apologized for any trouble they might have caused, although they were left with an imposing thought. That kind of anger and frustration, that is how an innocent person would respond. They'd want to do everything they could to clear their name, so they couldn't help but ask themselves, why hadn't Daniel Moore felt the same way? When the family didn't hear back from Moore, and when detectives informed them he still wouldn't speak to them nor take a polygraph, they decided they'd given him enough time and they needed to move forward with their plan. At that time, there were 6 different streets in the subdivision Moore was living in. The first letters and flyers were mailed to most, if not all, of the homes on his street. It showed photos of both Kristen and Moore and explained the details of the case and his refusal to cooperate. The following week, more letters and flyers went out, this time to homes on surrounding streets. Within a few weeks, flyers had been sent to almost everyone living in that subdivision. After a certain period of time, the family received a letter from a lawyer, Jeffrey Hansen, who had been hired by Moore. Hansen told the family that if they continued sending the flyers, his client was going to file a civil lawsuit against them, and in his opinion, it would be an open and shut case. The family called into Hansen's office, having a conversation with him, in which they told him all of the details of the case before they informed him they had no intention of stopping the flyers. They would continue, and if Moore wanted to take them to court, they were more than happy to go. In order to prove that they were maligning his character, Moore would have to prove the accusations were false, something Kristen's family believed he'd never be able to do. When the story about the flyers captured the attention of the local media, they rushed out to write up a front-page story about the family that was fighting for justice and the moral gray area bystanders found themselves in as they watched it unfold. Moore's lawyer, Jeffrey Hansen, felt his client was being needlessly harassed over a crime he was not involved in. Hansen explained, quote, "He was there at the club, but that was the extent of it. He didn't have anything to do with her disappearance. I mean, he's been forthcoming with his wife and his neighbors, and he's done the best he could to try and explain the situation to them. This is a woman with a broken heart. It's distressing to think that somebody can go around and say these things, and there is little remedy available for him to stop it." End quote. The family found this statement mildly annoying, if not entirely frustrating. It could have been hilarious if the situation wasn't so serious. They wondered how anyone could claim Moore had been forthcoming to anyone, given that he refused the polygraph and wouldn't cooperate with investigators. For Monica, it was pretty clear-cut. Daniel Moore's reluctance to cooperate and his threat of a lawsuit against the family did little to bolster his claim of innocence. She wasn't going to stop, as she told reporters, quote, "I'll keep mailing them out, and eventually I'll find somebody that knows something, or maybe he will walk into the police station and say, 'I'm here to clear my name.'" End quote. In addition to the flyers, the family put together a website where they could organize all of the known information about Kristen's disappearance. In future mailings, they began including the website URL, hoping that anyone who received it might be curious enough to dig in, especially since it was about one of their neighbors, friends, or coworkers. Monica printed out a lot of the flyers and went out herself, papering Arlington and placing them on windshields of cars in the neighborhood. She had yard signs created that read, "Dan Moore murdered Kristen Charbonneau," and posted them around town. And oftentimes, Monica and Alicia would head out to Arlington on weekends, where they'd hand the flyers out for hours at a time. Monica would later uncover Moore's wife's information and sent her a letter where she worked, but heard no reply. August of 2009 marked 4 years since Kristen had been reported missing, and not much had changed in the investigation. In hopes of finding something, anything that might lead to a resolution, Chief Brown of the Euless Police Department assigned 2 detectives to conduct a brand new investigation. Starting from day one, They were charged with working their own investigation to see if something was missed or another avenue may have evaded previous detectives. One interesting turn of events came in the form of the dancer who had walked Kristen toward the door the day she vanished. This woman, when contacted about the second investigation, refused to go to the station to speak with detectives. Instead, she asked them to meet her at a local gas station, and when they arrived, they found she had brought a man along with her. At the time, the witness told police she was extremely frightened to speak with them, as after she had identified Moore from a photo lineup, he'd begun following her to different clubs. In her account, Moore didn't approach her nor speak to her, but instead he sat at a table and stared at her all night long. These encounters were so disturbing, she ended up quitting dancing altogether. This second investigation, as it turned out, went very much like the first, with only one person of interest listed, that being Daniel Moore. Unfortunately, though, without something more, some new information, some solid evidence, there was little they could do. However, they did come to the conclusion that Kristen was no longer a missing person and instead noted she had likely been the victim of a homicide. Police turned to the public for assistance, with Lieutenant John Williams describing Moore as a person of interest and asking for anyone with information to come forward. He stated, quote, "He was the last person seen with her, and he hasn't said anything. He hasn't been cooperating. Then again, he's not required to." Some of his statements he made at the time didn't match the facts, so we'd certainly like to talk to him again, but he's invoking his right not to talk. Until somebody cooperates and gives us more information, we don't have a lot to go on. Anyone who was at the club that day and recalls anything, we'd sure like to hear from them. End quote. As I had mentioned previously, the community was somewhat divided by the flyers and the campaign the Charbonneau family were carrying out. Some felt Moore should be willing to clear his name, unable to understand why he hadn't. Others felt he hadn't been arrested nor proven guilty, and as such, it was out of line for the family to be harassing him, his family, and all of their friends and neighbors. For Monica, however, there was no other option. She explained, quote, "When you don't have news reporters on your lawn, you've got to do something. This is my search party. I'm hoping he will say enough is enough." End quote. 2 months later, in November, volunteers from United Response Search and Rescue came together to carry out a large-scale search of an undisclosed area. It was neither the first nor the last search carried out, as previous searches had focused in on the area surrounding baby dolls, believing it was possible that Kristen could have been murdered and dumped somewhere nearby. This search, as was the case with all previous searches, failed to yield any results. Monica noted that it was not a search for a missing person, saying, quote, "We just don't believe she's alive. If we did, we'd be looking in different places." End quote. It was beginning to seem like there would never be a full step forward, but everything was about to change. In the latter weeks of 2009, a woman strode into the Euless Police Department stating that she had information about Kristen's disappearance. When she sat down with detectives, the woman, who requested to remain anonymous, told them a bizarre story. According to her, she had a friend who was in a relationship with Daniel Moore, and this friend had told her that Moore had confessed to killing Kristen. At the time, this woman was living in a mobile home owned by Moore's aunt, and so the woman who had come to the police station gave them the address, explaining that she thought her friend wanted to come forward but was too scared to do so. The woman dating Moore was named Carolyn, and when police arrived at the mobile home, one of her children opened the door and asked what the family's website describes as a chilling question. The actual question has never been revealed. Once there, detectives managed to speak with Carolyn, who told them a strange story about how she was connected with Moore, what had happened in that time, and how she'd come to believe he had killed Kristen Charbonneau. According to her, she had known Moore since high school, but they'd fallen out of contact. That was remedied by a high school reunion where they saw one another and caught up. Carolyn told police she was disappointed to learn that Moore was married, but she didn't expect to hear much from him. Sometime after this reunion, he contacted her through Facebook. She called him, he didn't answer. Sounds typical. Hours later, when he called back, Carolyn was at a pawn shop trying to get money together to pay her motel bill. At the time, she was really down on her luck and was renting a hotel room which she shared with her children. Hearing this, Moore asked Carolyn to meet him, at which time he gave her money and apparently told her that if she was with him, the quality of her life would dramatically improve. Moore left things that day by telling Carolyn he'd take care of the motel bills, but then, as he so often did, he kind of faded out. For several weeks, there was no communication, and when the bill came due, Carolyn was desperate to get in touch with him. When Moore finally reached out, he told her to pack up all of her and her children's belongings as he had a new place for them to live. He took her to a mobile home owned by his aunt in the area of Kennedale, 20 miles southwest from Euless. Carolyn told police she was introduced to Moore's aunt and specifically told not to speak to any of the neighbors. From that point, the affair continued. Carolyn stated that Moore purchased school uniforms for her children and got them registered. He paid all of the bills, gave Carolyn both a cell phone and a car, and even opened a checking account for her into which he made deposits. Early on, he took Carolyn to the doctor to get her on birth control, only to find out she was already carrying his child. After a short back and forth, the two agreed on an abortion, which Moore paid for. According to Carolyn, Moore also used the mobile home as a partial office space, and one day, while she was home, she found one of his files which he had labeled Stalker Family. In the file, she found all of the letters the Charbonneau family had sent, and, curious, she decided to visit the website. She was so shocked by the accusation that she started telling her friends, many of whom told her that she needed to get away from Moore. One allegedly was so concerned that he told Carolyn if she didn't leave Moore, he couldn't be her friend anymore. Carolyn went on to say that one afternoon, Moore was complaining about her friends and their interference in the relationship. She finally confronted him about Kristen and demanded to know what happened, at which time, she claims, Moore broke down into tears and told her that he had accidentally killed Kristen. According to him, Kristen attacked him in the strip club parking lot with a nail file, and in response, he swung around and elbowed her in the temple, killing her. When she asked where the body was, Moore wouldn't answer, saying only that it would never be found. Sinking into paranoia at that point, Carolyn says she stayed at the mobile home but began conducting her own investigation. She took photographs of a hole in the wall she believed was from a bullet, of a stain on the mattress she thought was blood, and she even saved the bag that was in the vacuum the day she moved in. She started thinking that the mobile home was haunted and convinced herself that the ghost was Kristen, and so she tried to communicate with her, hoping this supposed ghost could tell her where her body could be found. At that point, Carolyn started keeping a diary so that she could note everything that happened every day in order to keep the story straight in her head. At one point, she had a conversation with Moore where she reported being concerned about a foul smell emanating from beneath the trailer. According to her, Moore said it was a broken sewer line and that he had a plumber who was going to come and fix it before pouring down lime. Concerned about one of her children's allergies, Carolyn asked about the lime, to which she claims Moore replied that it's totally safe and it will cover up any smell, including the scent of human decay. At this point, Carolyn believed Kristen was buried beneath the trailer, and she informed her children of the situation and warned them that Moore could be dangerous. She gave her statement to detectives voluntarily and even provided them with the photo she had taken, a swatch cut from the mattress, and the vacuum bag. She led them to both the mattress and the hole in the wall so they could analyze it for themselves. Sometime during this visit, Moore's aunt became aware of a police presence and notified her nephew. Moore picked up the phone and, according to Carolyn, called her up and told her to stop talking to the police, take a pill, shut up, and get it together. At this point, Moore seemingly grew more paranoid as he refused to speak to Carolyn on the phone, and even when he visited, they communicated by passing notes back and forth as he believed investigators had the home and their phones bugged. According to the files, the police didn't bug anything. A few months later, in February of 2010, investigators made their move. Based upon the information gathered throughout their investigation and the statements given by Carolyn, they obtained a warrant for Daniel Moore's arrest. On Friday, February 26th, Moore was pulled over while driving home, at which time he was officially arrested and charged with first-degree murder. When Moore's wife was informed of the arrest, she was completely caught off guard and told police that much of this was the result of that website and the letters of the Charbonneau family blaming her husband for a crime he didn't commit. At that point, she became aware of Carolyn, the affair, the alleged confession, and all of the money Moore had been spending on his mistress. According to investigators, Moore refused to speak with them while he was being held, although they say he behaved in a manner that suggested he was very nervous. Bail was set at $35,000, a sum that the Moores didn't simply have laying around. By whatever methods necessary, his wife managed to get the cash together, and less than 24 hours after being arrested, Moore was released on bail. One curious detail reported on the family's website is that when Moore was arrested, his first call wasn't to his wife, it wasn't to his lawyer, it was to Carolyn. While no one can say with any certainty, it's believed he made this call not for bail, but to find out specifically what exactly Carolyn had told investigators. Following the arrest, Carolyn told police that Moore's aunt kicked her out of the home, putting her and her kids on the street. Reportedly, the aunt told Carolyn that everything would have been fine if she could have just kept her mouth shut, essentially blaming the entire situation on her. By that point, it was a little late to try and pull anything back. The cat was out of the bag. But unfortunately, it wouldn't remain there. Following the arrest, the story blasted back into the headlines. Sergeant Gary Landers of the Euless Police told reporters that the arrest had come as the result of new evidence, though he noted Kristen's remains had not been found. Asked their feelings, the Charbonneau family issued a statement reading, quote, "Our feelings are so mixed right now that I find it difficult to distinguish between happiness and sadness. We have endured many angry people who believed we targeted an innocent man and threatened to shut down this website. Our work continues as we prepare for the trial of Dan Moore." End quote. In early March, the affidavit for an arrest was released and revealed that Moore had been arrested primarily based upon the statements from Carolyn in conjunction with all the other evidence gathered over the previous 4.5 years. Discussing evidence itself, the affidavit noted that several cell phones and digital devices had been seized from the mobile home Carolyn had been staying in, and they described an alleged bullet hole found in the headboard of a bed. In regard to the apparent blood stain on the mattress, it was noted that while the stain had been analyzed, no DNA was recovered. Throughout the course of 2010, investigators continued working on the case, wanting to build up as much evidence as possible. This evidence was handed over to the Tarrant County Prosecutor's Office, where Betty Arvin was set to bring the case before a grand jury in December. For the family, it was a difficult waiting game. The legal process can be exceedingly slow, and for the Charbonneaus, they tried to find solace in the fact that Moore had been charged, though with each passing day, they remained in the loop as they watched the wheels of justice move at a glacial pace. For David, it was an extremely difficult time. Learning of the arrest did feel like a step forward, but it also seemed to be confirmation that his firstborn was deceased. He explained to CNN how hard the years had been and how he had sometimes struggled to suppress his urge to become a vigilante. He explained, quote, "I would wake up every morning and every night looking at my shotgun. It would be the first thing there, and there were many times it would be loaded. I know that sounds as sick as could be, and as a father and a human being, I never thought I could even think that way. But when something like this is taken from you, and you as a father, you find out what you're really made of. I guess I was made of more than I thought I was." End quote. For Monica, it was a continuation of their search for truth, to learn what had become of their daughter, and more than anything else, to finally bring her home so she could receive a proper burial, and so they could have a place to grieve. Asked what she wanted out of the arrest, Monica replied, quote, "I would want him to tell us where she's at so that we can bring her home and have that closure. I'm not sure if I want to know what happened that day. I don't know if that would help me. but I do want to know where she's at. That I need to know." End quote. Everything seemed to be falling into place until everything fell apart. The case was presented to a Tarrant County grand jury in the early months of 2011, but in the end, the jury declined to issue an indictment. Prosecutor Betty Arvin was matter-of-fact in her statement of the events, telling reporters that the Euless police had done everything they possibly could, but regardless of the evidence in their possession, it didn't appear to be enough. For Euless Captain Gary Landers, he couldn't put his full disappointment into words. He explained, quote, "We're at a standstill right now. We've investigated it thoroughly, gone through it a number of times with numerous people to make sure no stone was left unturned. At this point, we have no new evidence to follow up on. Until new evidence surfaces or someone else comes forward, we've exhausted all the leads we have at this point." End quote. Landers went on to state that Daniel Moore remains a suspect in the case, and should new evidence come to the surface, it would be taken back to the grand jury. While the proceedings of the grand jury are subject to confidentiality, meaning we have no way of knowing what exactly was presented nor why the jurors chose not to indict, it was later revealed that a key piece of evidence had been withdrawn. Reportedly, Moore's mistress, Carolyn, went on to retract her statement to investigators, leaving them with little more than circumstantial evidence. Her admission to investigators led to the arrest warrant, and her recanting of that statement seems to have led to the failure to achieve an indictment. 6 years later, in August of 2017, 12 years after Kristen disappeared, NBC News focused in on the case for their Dateline columns featuring forgotten cold cases. Sergeant Todd Murphy, one of the detectives assigned to the new investigation, was both frustrated and heartbroken with their inability to move forward. Sergeant Murphy explained, quote, "I still receive phone calls about this case about once a month, and every time bones are discovered in the area, I check to see if there's a DNA match. When I talk to the Charbonneau family, I see my own family in their eyes. I couldn't imagine not knowing what happened to my child, and I feel responsible." End quote. Asked her feelings about this painful open wound and Daniel Moore's skating free without facing trial, Monica reiterated her dedication to seeing justice served. She explained, quote, "Kristen loved her family and loved being a big sister. She never missed a birthday or Mother's Day. She was always there. I'm 12 years in, but I believe that we will find her. I've known for a while they will not find her alive, but I want peace for my family." End quote. When last seen, Kristen Elizabeth Charbonneau was described as being a white female with brown hair and eyes, standing 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighing approximately 112 pounds. Kristen's stage name was Devon, and she often went by the nickname Chris. She has been known to wear either green or blue-tinted contacts. Kristen has a small mole on her chest, a small scar above her right eyebrow, and a scar on the big toe of her right foot. She has piercings in her right nostril, ears, right eyebrow, navel, and tongue. She has previously fractured her collarbone. At the time of her disappearance, Kristen is believed to have been wearing blue jeans with a yellow stripe down the side, silver earrings, a silver necklace, and a tongue ring. She should have been carrying a gym bag, which has been described as pink, with either a gray stripe or gray trim. The bag would have contained a change of clothing. She was last seen exiting Baby Dolls, a topless bar along South Industrial Boulevard, FM 157, along the border between Euless and Fort Worth. She exited the club at approximately 3:41 p.m. at the same time Daniel Moore was leaving. When her cab arrived a few minutes later, she was nowhere to be found. Kristen was 24 years old at the time of her disappearance, and if alive today, she'd be turning 43 this August. For nearly 20 years, Kristen's fate has remained unknown. Her family, already devastated by immeasurable loss and grief, have never learned the truth of their daughter's final hours, nor have they been able to recover her remains or see the man they believe is responsible brought to justice for this cruel and horrifying act. For them, It's a battle that never ends, a desperate search for their firstborn child and the person who has made them face these last 19 years without the love, affection, and company of their beloved daughter and sister. On their official website, the family made many statements about Kristen, many of them beautiful and filled with lovely words. One speaks more loudly and reads, quote, "Kristen was not just a dancer at a club who disappeared. She was a daughter, a sister, and a friend. She was an adult, but had the heart of a child. Kristen would rather have stayed a young teenager living at home. She struggled with life and the world the way it was. She was so naive, it was funny. She was loyal to her family and very close to her brothers and sisters." Now, I know normally this is the time where I break out all of the theories and we start digging in, finding what makes the most sense, what fits, what doesn't, and everything in between. In today's episode, though, I won't be discussing the theories. Truth be told, there's only one theory in this case, and despite numerous attempts to put together a theory section that works, makes sense, and analyzes the evidence, I found after several drafts there was little I could add beyond my own opinion and speculation. Everything there is to discuss about this case, at least everything that has been publicly released, was touched on in the evidence section. Every attempt I made felt like a painstaking reiteration of all the evidence I went over for the first hour, and as such, spending another 30 minutes felt redundant and pointless. This case seems fairly self-explanatory, and assuming that all of the theories and police and the family are all accurate, again, we would have only one theory to analyze. So, I hope you'll understand my choice not to analyze that theory repetitively. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Kristen Charbonneau, there are many newspaper articles and websites discussing her case. For this episode, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram had the best coverage. The Charbonneau family continues to maintain a website where all of this and more is available, and I highly recommend you check it out. The site can be found at themurderofkristencharbonneau.webs.com. The link will be in the show notes. Finally, I'd like to note that this case was previously covered on the amazing Gone Cold podcast, which I cannot more highly recommend that you check out. If you have any information about the disappearance of Kristen Charbonneau, please contact the Euless Police Department at 817-685-1500. Her case number is 0500050619. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Camelia Tyler, Christine Greco, Danny Renee, Daerthy, Denise Dingsdale, Diane Dyson, Eloanne Meyer, Fabulous TT, Guillerme Pinto, Jennifer Winkler, Julie A. Mangano, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, K.Y., Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Madison Lahoulier, Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Shures, Sarah Lyons, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tiffany Nelson, and Tom Radford. Without your amazing support, this show would not be possible, So thank you all so much for contributing to Trace Evidence. One quick reminder, if you're planning on attending CrimeCon this year in Orlando, Florida, use promo code TRACE at crimecon.com to save 10% off your pass. Once again, that's promo code TRACE at crimecon.com. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This concludes our coverage of the disappearance of Kristen Charbonneau, at least for now. A case so close to being solved you can almost feel it. Hopefully, sooner than later, the truth will come to the surface, and Kristen's family will be able to bring her home, and the person responsible will face justice. I want to thank you for listening again, and I hope you'll join me next time for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.